Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new video. Belarus is a nation that most people know only for its potato-loving dictator. Though he does love potatoes and being a dictator, Lukashenko once fought against France. To find out how, we must go to the Western African Republic of the Ivory Coast at the start of the Ivorian Civil War. On September 19, 2002, parts of the military of the Ivory Coast rebelled against President Laurent Gbagbo over the crushing of resistance to his victory in the 2000 elections. The rebels took the northern half of the country, including two of the biggest cities, and contested the capital city, Abidjan. And this chaos is where the French first took interest. The French, who 100 years earlier had colonized most of Western Africa, including the Ivory Coast, returned back to Africa in the late 80s and 90s, heading UN peacekeeping missions and supporting various states in their civil wars. By 2002, they had already participated in conflicts in Djibouti, Chad, and Rwanda. So when the civil war started, the French immediately went in, saying they were fulfilling their end of a defense agreement signed with the Ivory Coast in 1961. They went in under the codename Operation Unicorn, which, side note, who thought the symbol that best represents an operation going into a bloody civil war was a unicorn? Anyways, what is important to note is that this was solely a French operation, not to be administered with the United Nations. In the next few months, the French would expand their presence. President Gbagbo would ask the French to administer ceasefires and ask for more French troops. The French gladly accepted, sending 2,000 more troops by February 2003. And later that summer, 4,600 French troops would be in the Ivory Coast. And now the UN gave their official support to the French mission. The French mission by the end of 2003 was a complete success, with the French being a respectable force in the view of both sides of the conflict. On the other side of Europe lies the Republic of Belarus. Unwillingly born from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it was and still is poor. But what they weren't poor in was in military equipment. In 1992, they had over 3,400 tanks and over 3,000 other armored vehicles. And for aircraft, they had at least 79 helicopters and at least 100 jets. Wanting to increase the wealth of the new republic, they chose to sell some of these stockpiles. At first, they sold to underground networks such as drug cartels and arms dealers, but as they still had too much to sell, they sold to entire nations. At first was Peru, but then they expanded into the African market, selling to the war-torn states of Zaire, Angola, and Sierra Leone. They would go further into some of these countries, for example, sending advisors to Ethiopia in 1999 to help their war against Eritrea. The turn of the century saw more buyers for Belarus, some more stable than others: Morocco, Iran, Algeria, and many more. Eventually, when the war started on September 19th, Belarus immediately went to President Gbagbo with their decade-old stockpile. Gbagbo immediately bought what he could: 12 BMP armored personnel carriers and 2 Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters. The next year, Gbagbo needed more and had the money to buy it. He bought 19 more armored vehicles and 4 Su-25 fighter jets. Belarus saw more money to be made and wanted to make sure their aircraft were put to good use, so they sent pilots and mechanics. In total, there were 8 men, 6 mechanics and 2 pilots. The crew was sent to Yamoussoukro Airport, which they coincidentally shared with a French paratrooper group. This is where the Belarusians would train pilots and would launch special combat missions. Belarus would also send a team of 4 to be with a larger group of former Soviet pilots operating a cargo plane in the capital. And so in the view of the Belarusian commanders, another successful deal was completed. And so they turned a blind eye to the war in the Ivory Coast as they shifted to focusing on deals with Libya and Sudan. When the Belarusian jets and pilots arrived at Yamoussoukro Airport in 2003, the French watched them with eyes of untrust. The French intelligence agencies worked day by day, noting their movements and plans. Outside of the feelings of France and Belarus, the civil war in the Ivory Coast continued on. At least 1,500 were dead by July 2004, and multiple ceasefires were attempted, but one way or another they failed. It was a deadly standstill between the northern rebels and the southern government forces. Eventually, some peace did arrive on July 30th, 2004, when the rebels and government forces agreed to a ceasefire. The most important agreement in this ceasefire was that the rebels would surrender their weapons on October 15th. The months passed, but on October 13th, the rebels announced that they would not give up their weapons. And so, sick of attempting to negotiate and wanting to crush the rebels for good, President Gbagbo launched an operation on November 4th. This was called Operation Dignity, which this is actually a good name for an operation. And most importantly for this story, he would use the Belarusian pilots to bomb the biggest rebel city, Bakwe. The results were deadly. 85 civilians and an unknown number of rebels were killed. The French were also asked to do bombings by President Gbagbo, but they refused. And now we get to the incident. On November 6, 2004, at 1:20 p.m. local time, the Belarusian pilots had a military compound marked on the western side of Bakwe. One of the jets made visual of the compound. It then aimed its nose down towards it and released its missiles, striking the compound. And then the plane put its nose all the way up and disappeared into the clouds. The compound was the Lycée Descartes High School. It was used as a base for the French military. The attack killed 9 French soldiers and an American humanitarian worker, and left 38 injured. However, the Belarusian pilots returned back to their airbase, which, remember, they shared this with the French. They acted like nothing happened and started refueling their jets. Upon the French military realizing just what happened, they called the French president for what to do next. He ordered the Belarusian planes to be destroyed, and so the paratroopers immediately destroyed the planes with guided anti-tank missiles, and this killed one of the Ivorian mechanics. This pretty much destroyed the most useful part of the Ivorian Air Force, and none of the planes would ever be repaired. The entire Belarusian team was captured and questioned, but then were released. They quickly packed their stuff and fled to Ghana, and then fled to Togo, which they were then arrested, but the French let them go, and so they would flee back to Belarus. For the 4 Belarusians operating the cargo plane, them and the entire ex-Soviet crew would be arrested, but then released. For the French, this began a time of very high tensions. A few clashes between government forces and French troops would occur, but nothing major. The public of the Ivory Coast turned against the French and rioted, wanting them out. The French would have to evacuate their citizens and started a UN-backed embargo. But they would continue their mission until 2007, and to this day continues to do peacekeeping missions in Africa. For the Belarusians, this was swept under the rug and ignored. They kept selling weapons and sending crews, but they wouldn't participate in any more combat missions. In 2005, CNN reported that another 10 Belarusians arrived to do military advisory and maintaining equipment. The government of Belarus quickly denied this. However, President Gbagbo said it was true, though he would not say where these Europeans came from. Belarus would continue giving military support to the Ivory Coast, sending about $8.5 million in equipment. In 2021, the French would attempt to do a trial for the Belarusians involved, but dropped continuing it as they couldn't be arrested. For the Ivory Coast, the civil war restarted and would continue on for another 2 years. It wasn't as bloody as before, however, and in 2006, the Ivory Coast national football team made it to the finals of the World Cup, which started a ceasefire that ended this conflict the next year. Civil war would return to the Ivory Coast for a brief time in late 2010 and early 2011 over contested election results. The result would be President Gbagbo would be arrested and tried for reported crimes against humanity, though these couldn't be substantiated, and he was released in 2021. And well, that concludes the story of the French-Belarusian micro-conflict in Africa. I just wanted to try something more modern out because I really don't know what I want my next video to be. Let me know if you want more, and I'll see you in the next video where I return to the interwar and early World War II era. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like and bell, and if you want more, subscribe. Have a good day, and goodbye.